So what have you been up to?
Well, I've been taking in the sights in Lafayette, and I've been learning what it's like not to have a deadline every day. I've been doing a little bit of writing and book reviewing, a lot of reading, and playing a lot of terrible golf, very enthusiastically, visiting, traveling, family. Married off a daughter last weekend.
Congratulations.
In New York,
Mazel
yeah.
tov.
And generally enjoying life in retirement very much. So I miss the company of the people at NPR. I mean, I don't miss doing the work, but I miss going to work every day with people whom I knew for decades, or even some of them just for years, but I enjoyed them, and they were smart, funny people, and they were engaged in an important kind of work. And as I said, I don't miss the work, but I miss the people.
You spent a long time at NPR. Let me ask you about a burning issue of the day to get right into it. What do you think of the new Morning Edition theme song?
Okay. One rule I learned is that if you change the theme music, people will hate you. It doesn't matter what the show is. It doesn't matter how bad the old music was. If you change the music, people will complain. We changed the All Things Considered music a bit over 20 years ago, 25, I think, years ago. To be honest, I never liked the orchestration that we put in place then. Complaints about it raged. Mail came in for weeks and weeks against it. And now that we have a generation that's grown up hearing that theme, I'm sure that when All Things Considered changes it, if it does, people will hate whatever we do after it. They will hate. It becomes part of people's lives. I once learned a lesson when I went to London. I was there to help build up NPR's international coverage as we were launching this new morning program, Morning Edition. And a guy who was the head of BBC Radio told me about how they had recently changed the format of their morning program, the Today program. And people were furious. People were just furious. And what people told them was, it wasn't that they really cared so much that prayer for the day or thought for the day, which were features of this program, had been moved by 10 minutes. You know, it was that they had known for years that if you left when prayer for the day went on the radio, if you left the house at that moment, you would get to the train station exactly on time to get to make your commute into the city. And to mess with that was to change the whole body rhythm of the audience.
Lots of missed trains.
Exactly. It was totally, they were accused of completely disorienting people and disturbing their lives. So it's a no-win. It's a no-win. It sounds, you know, when I've heard it, it sounds contemporary. It sounds like 2019 to me. And maybe to younger ears, it's more appealing. I don't know.
Show of hands in the audience. How many people like the new theme? Wow. Okay, well, that was somewhat definitive.
So it's not a roaring success here.
Now you know where all the letters are coming from when your former colleagues ask you. Yeah. So I alluded to this a little bit in the intro. You are somebody who cares very, very deeply about language, about its use, elocution of it, precise meaning of words. You've talked about how that was important to your father and how he made that important to you. You mentioned a little bit on that on air as you were signing off from NPR. Do you think that we, in this day and age of social media, place enough importance on those sorts of ideas?
Well, we don't obsess over them the way my parents' generation did. And I should explain that my parents were first-generation Americans. And whereas my mother, I mean, all four of my grandparents were Yiddish speakers who came to America from Eastern Europe. And only one of them, my mother's father, went to learn English as soon as he got here. And spoke to his 8 children in English. All the other grandparents addressed my father and mother in Yiddish, in a different language. My father was born in 1905. There was no radio yet on which to hear people speaking the native language of this country. He learned English in school. Learning English was extremely important. He made a career in the New York City public school system, which lived by a principle that was later explained to me by a linguist at the University of Pennsylvania, Labov, who was an expert in American dialects. And he said New York was unique in stigmatizing its own accent. It was the rare place where if you wanted to get ahead in New York, don't have a New York accent. My father, working in the school system, went through this incredibly rigorous application to advance to department chairman or assistant principal. And the last step, he explained to me years later, he felt everything had been rendered as objective as possible. You went to some class you'd never seen before and gave a lesson, and an observer and an examiner watched you do it. You took multiple written exams in your subjects and in pedagogy and whatever else. But the last thing he said was where they could really get you for whatever reason they wanted, which was the speech test. And they flunked him on the speech test. So he went back to the beginning of this process and began it all over again. And at one point had an old-fashioned Wallensack tape recorder that he borrowed from someplace, brought it home, and I listened to my father reading diphthongs into a microphone to practice and to get right the sufficiently non-New York accent that he would have. My mother went to Hunter College in New York City, which was the women's equivalent of City College of New York in those days. And she and the two sisters who did it with her, sounded, they didn't quite sound like Eleanor Roosevelt, but they sounded as if they came from about a quarter of the way across the Atlantic Ocean toward Britain, speech being a marker of the fact that you were American. You spoke English, you didn't speak it with a foreign accent, and you spoke it properly. And in that society that I grew up in, these were obsessive concerns. And it wasn't just about conforming. It was this great love of being American, and they were raised by people who had gotten in a boat and couldn't speak a word of the language that people spoke here, and had come here, thank God, and it was very important to them.
It seems like you and other people who were important to the very early years of getting NPR started, making it the national presence that it is today, yeah, placed great value, though, on the language and being very precise with it, yes, especially because NPR has been very good over the years of taking people into its ranks that don't have what you would consider a traditional broadcast voice in some cases, but yeah, they were good journalists or they were good storytellers, yeah, and you recognized that trait in them, and inherent in that would seem to be the language is paramount. Would you agree?
Yes, I think I would agree with that, and I think there are people. You know, when I came to NPR, one of my earlier bosses told me that we were not so formal. One thing we should not say is, this was a staple of radio speech for many years, that now the news, the NYEWS, and that this was the proper way, according to most program directors you would have encountered in my youth. This was the only way to say news, was news. In fact, it was the way to say New York. Noah Adams and I, we worked together for many years, where I think we tried to explain to young people when they would send us a pronouncer for a place that WHY was not actually Y, but when we saw that sound, that was why. That was why. And radio people were among the last people to say, which will you dress up on, on Thanksgiving, as though those are two different sounds. And when I came to NPR was, I was told that, we relax about things like this. We shouldn't be using unnaturally correct pronunciations that would sound odd, but we should speak in a literate, conversational way. And
was there a push to sound like the people that you were trying to reach?
No. In fact, the thing that I liked about it was, when I came to NPR, let's say, typically a commercial radio station or network would have a sound that people aspired to. Now, by now, NPR has a sound, but when I first came there, it had a great variety and a great belief in the individuality of people. Scott Simon, whom I first encountered he was a freelancer in Chicago, and I was involved in hiring him and then edited him for a while. Scott does not have a conventional voice for for broadcasting. He writes sentences that violate every rule of writing short, declarative. You know, I'm in the midst of this big personal project of reading Proust. Scott writes Proustian sentences for the radio, and he, on the other hand, he is uniquely Scott. I mean, there's an identity there, and
his producers have described it as Simonizing the language.
Yeah,
I've talked to a producer of his who described it precisely that way.
Yes, I used to kid Scott that I have a drawer that I've saved of adjectives that I took out of his pieces, and that if he needs them at some point, I can give him back some. But he's, to my mind, he was a real eye-opener, or ear-opener, I guess, to me, and that he, doing his thing, sounding like himself, not at all sounding like a conventional radio news guy, could mix vivid descriptive writing with not natural sound that he would record, with good interviews, and do stories that would make good on this promise of good radio, which is we take you someplace. You know, the pictures are better on radio. They're the pictures in your mind, and Scott did that more consistently and better than anyone I ever worked with, perhaps save Susan Stamberg. So we didn't. The idea wasn't. Now what happened was 5 years later we had generated a class of young reporters who sounded an awful lot like Scott Simon. Nobody told them to sound like that, but they modeled themselves. We had a producer on All Things Considered some years later, who on a couple of projects was my field producer, Ira Glass.
Never heard of him.
Never. Ira went off and created This American Life, and a generation of people talking like Ira Glass came on the air. But that was something organic. That was imitative. It was what people were doing. It wasn't. I don't think it was ever NPR saying, "Here's how you should." Here's the way I think you should sound.
Is there a himself or a herself that you think might be outside the bounds? We hear criticism sometimes, and I will say this particularly gets leveled, and I will say also, in many cases unfairly, at young female reporters. The notion of upspeak, taking the end of your sentences and going up, or vocal fry is another term that gets bandied about. And these are typically used as derogatory terms,
yes.
And a lot of times applied to people who are just getting into the business, perhaps just finding their voice, as the saying goes. Where do you think, as journalism goes forward, especially as NPR, especially as trying to bring in a younger listenership in many cases, where are those lines to be drawn?
Well, I guess the real answer is I don't know. Someplace, but I don't know. To me, these things are all art and no science. It requires judgment, and you have to listen to it. I did one of the first pieces about what somebody named Uptalk. I remember I'd gotten a message from a publicist for a book publisher, and it was a young woman on the phone who said, "Hi, I'm calling from ABC Publishers, and I was wondering if you might be interested in a book that we're publishing, and the author is going to be in Washington next April." And every sentence, to my ear, had a question mark on the end of it, and I played it for a producer, and I said, you know, I had just heard a guy on Morning Edition, I think he was a Republican pollster, talking like this, and I said, "This thing has got. It used to be young women I heard doing this. Now it's crossed the aisle. It's now everybody is talking like this. You have a certain age." And we did a piece about it. We called up the girl, the young woman, and she was. We didn't want to embarrass her, but she was very happy to be used as an example. But it's a way people started talking at some point. And I was once confused by one of our reporters. I thought she was asking me a question, in a conversation, and I jumped in, and she wasn't. She was just making a statement that happened to sound an awful lot like a question to me. So I think that part of I think the challenge of having a radio program that goes on for what is it, 40, 50 years almost, it's being flexible. And there are things that you'd hear on All Things Considered today that you never would have heard in 1976 or in 1986. And part of the challenge is to keep it in some ways stable and predictable, and in other ways surprising and new. So if people sound a bit different, so be it. If, on the other hand, there's sort of purposely verbally slumming, and being excessively casual to be cool and to try to show that they are not a part of some mainstream majority media, I'd say can that. You know, this is it's not really a profession, but it's certainly a high trade. It's a high classy trade, and when we speak on the radio, we're not just venting our own personal feelings and observations. We're doing a job. We're working within certain disciplines, and part of that job and part of the mission, I think, of what we do, is to set a standard for spoken English. I've met people from China who told me they listened to NPR, and that's how they learned how to speak English, or they perfected their speech. I've met immigrants who came here and who found NPR very helpful to listen to and to get a sense of how you should speak this language, the way that my parents had learned to speak the language. And I think one of the side jobs of a national broadcaster is a little guardianship of the language, and that requires some respect for grammar and for less uptalk. Yes.
We've gotten a couple of questions from listeners that I want to put to you during the course of the night. Previous to, they were very excited to put these into the queue.
Right.
One of these goes similar to what we were just talking about. It says, we know that technology has revolutionized communication and network news.
Yeah.
Please assess the changes you've seen in how news is reported. There's a more casual style now than 40 years ago, this person says. Do you think that affects credibility?
Well, there are several very interesting questions there. The first thing I would say is that I think there is the fallacy of a stable past. That is, most of us recall what the media were like when we were young, when we were in our salad days, and feel that that's the way things were. And now things have changed a great deal. Whereas, in fact, things are always changing in this. This is journalism is part business. It's very dependent on technology. I always like to remind people that, let's say, the first 20 years, 25 years of NPR's existence, technology tilted our way. In the 1970s, most people didn't have FM radios. And the Federal Communications Commission had assigned to non-commercial radio stations, for the most part, all the frequencies under 92 FM, precisely because that was the least listened to, most useless part of spectrum that you could have. And people didn't have the radios even to receive this. I placed the date in June 1967, when the Beatles released Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band. And for the first time, the most popular record in the world, the most awaited record in the world, was actually rather interestingly produced and would benefit from being heard in stereo, let's say, and sounded kind of stupid on an AM radio station with a very compressed signal. And there really accelerated a rush from the AM radio network to FM radio, from AM radio to FM radios. And a lot of us, certainly of my generation, we all grew up thinking of radio as AM radio, and FM radio was this thing that either audiophiles or classical music listeners or Chinese restaurants would play in the speaker. So with every year, more and more people began listening to the technology that we use to get to them. And so NPR benefited tremendously from technological change, even if that change was conceived in the late 1930s and come to market in the 1940s and really only took off seriously in the 1970s.
So what about the age of Twitter and Snapchat and Instagram? Well,
so now we're into a different era altogether. It's not just those, it's the
and podcasting.
Podcasting, it's the app that will send news alerts to my phone. So that it used to be said when I was beginning in radio that people heard about the news first from radio, and then they might learn more about it either from television or from the next day's newspaper, or when they still existed, from the afternoon newspaper. Today, the first place that I hear anything is on my telephone. I get an alert from one of the newspapers I subscribe to, or from the Associated Press, or from NPR, and I'm wired. I'm wired. I remember many years ago, Peter Jennings, who was the ABC anchorman and a friend, talked about the problem that the networks had created for themselves in television, which was they had given local stations access to their footage, to their news film, before they came on the air with the evening news, so that you now didn't have to, when you waited until 6:30 in the evening or 7 o'clock, that wouldn't be the first time you could see the actual footage from wherever it was, Lebanon or some big breaking news story. You now could see all that in the local news that came on earlier during the day. The network had, in a way, undermined its own scoop, its daily scoop. And he said the pressure on them meant that the network show, therefore, had to have some value added. It had to be providing context and background and doing the things that would make seeing the footage more valuable. That was the challenge. And in those days, I think ABC actually became a leading network by doing that sort of thing, by understanding that even though it's very much a visual picture medium, they were no longer this dominant source on their network shows. Likewise, today, there are challenges to the daily broadcast by time shifting through podcasts and through a variety of other media. And this requires lots of smart thinking about what's important, what's trivial, and you don't have to twitch to and change your show every 5 minutes because someone has insulted somebody else, which happens an awful lot nowadays in Washington. And I think that the problem I have with the podcast, the concern I have about the podcast is that the national program, while it's inconvenient, it only is there when the network puts it on the air, not when you might want to hear it most conveniently, is in some way a national civic act that we're all hearing the same thing at the same time, and there's some kind of implied community in that event, which is to me a very important concept in public radio, since I think that what we have is not just a bunch of listeners, but I think we have people who are engaged in some kind of civic activity together.
You're talking also a little bit about being proactive versus being reactive in what you cover. You can react to someone's tweet, or you can dig and dig and dig on a story for a long time, and that story goes out when it's done. You were involved with the coverage of the 2016 election. You've talked about how there were some things you were surprised by. You've said you were not surprised that Donald Trump became the Republican nominee, but you were surprised that he won the general election. NPR, writ large, seemed very surprised that that happened, despite having spent weeks and weeks and weeks out everywhere in the country, it seemed like, talking to voters of every political stripe. To the idea of being reactive versus proactive, do you think that, not just for NPR, but for other news outlets too, should be a lesson in how we go about coverage of the election next year in terms of how we think about and how we perhaps weight what we are told?
Well, there should be we should all remember that the purpose of news organizations is fundamentally not predictive. I mean, it really, the value of a news program is not whether it tells you in advance who's going to win the election. We're not, we're not magicians. I think that in 2016, as in most years that I recall, journalism or political coverage was very poll-driven, and in a way that was a positive thing at some level, because if I go to Chillicothe, Ohio, and talk to 15 people, which seemed to be something that I did every other year for a while, and the 15 people I speak to include 5 who have no idea that there's an election coming up, and of the other 10, 6 who are going for one person and 4 for another. I cannot take that breakdown to the bank and say, I've just come up with the key to how Southern Ohio is going to break in the election. A poll with a good sample and done by a respectable pollster is much more valuable. In 2016, now you could say that one thing you should disregard in all polling is national polls, because if in fact one candidate carries New York and California by 70% of the vote or something, the national poll result will skew in a way that doesn't predict how the Electoral College will turn out. The polls we were looking at were mostly national polls, and they predicted that Hillary Clinton would win. And as for the popular vote, which is what they were counting, she did. She did. However,
that's not how we decide a president.
That's not how we decide a presidency, and we decide the presidency in a way that's almost impossible to game out and predict. There was a pollster who told me at the time, when we were going over on air, doing a kind of a post-mortem of what had happened, that I think it was Wisconsin, where nobody it seemed to have done any poll that ever came close to showing anything like the result that there was in Wisconsin.
Including the Clinton campaign.
Including the Clinton campaign, yeah. I mean, again, we talked about this at NPR when I was there after the election. Our mission is not we're not the Vegas sports line. You know, our job is not to predict correctly that Toronto is going to win the NBA Finals in 5 games, and that's what we're doing. We should be enlightening people as to what's going on in the campaign and what these candidates stand for. A man who was very, I felt very close to, our former president, Frank Mankiewicz, was well known as Robert Kennedy's press secretary and later George McGovern's campaign manager, and he was a columnist, and he was a very insightful and funny guy. And he once said, not being funny, that the great writer of presidential election books, Theodore White, who wrote The Making of the President, 1960, and then The Making of the President, 1964 and 68, whatever, that he felt that Theodore H. White had destroyed American political reporting by writing books that got inside the campaigns and tried to take an insider's look at all these little tactical decisions that were made to run a presidential campaign, and made political reporting all about the tactics of campaign operatives and managers, as opposed to, well, what is this guy running on and what's that guy running? Which is, you probably can't fill up 6 months of programming with those questions. We might be able to sum up what the candidates are for a lot more effectively, but Frank would say, well, that's much more a mission of what a democracy is about than reading books that make you feel who's the more clever advance man for which campaign. And the older I get, the more I sympathize with Frank's point of view. I don't care that much who's reforming his or her campaign and firing the manager or the campaign staff, and who's I care about who's giving them a lot of money, if that might influence something. But
this gets to something I wanted to ask you about, which is, do you feel that, especially in an age where we all get alerts on our phones, we all see a tweet that somebody has 30 seconds before done something and somebody has rushed out a tweet, do you find that the coverage today is more breathless in its tone than it used to be, that there's less analysis, there's less contextualizing, and it's more about, despite the fact it's harder and harder to tell who got something first or got a scoop, people seem more and more interested in being the first person with that tweet to get it retweeted. Do you see that? Well,
I see a tremendous amount on cable television, which has become is taken as representative of the news media very often. There's a tremendous amount of discussion. I mean, you can just turn the dial and watch one panel after another talking about some exchange of tweets. What I don't like, what worries me is not that, it's that I find that in the panels that do the discussing, I see a kind of an unhealthy mix of characters that, along with the reporter, whose job is to go talk with people, see things, ask people, question, corroborate stories, there'll be a former politician from one party or another, there'll be a former U.S. attorney who knows what actually has to grind, there'll be an opinion journalist who's only there to advance a particular point of view, and the reporter gets thrown into this mix, and into a talk mix, in which, again, I think that reporting is not just talking, and that's why perhaps it should be distinguished by a little bit of formality of language, to show that that person has actually tried to nail down a story and be confident in it before being dragged into a discussion of what it says about the particular player, or not to be cute about it. It's half the time it's just about whether it's about Donald Trump or Nancy Pelosi is what's going on. So I think that it's breathless. It's let's immediately hear from a round table of people how who will have the most clever insight into this thing that has barely happened. And I was watching a cable show not long ago where the New York Times reporter who had done a story about Deutsche Bank, where he'd reported the fact that people at Deutsche Bank had looked at some transactions of Trump's accounts, and they had thought about reporting them as possible money laundering. And so this fellow came on I thought in a very rigorous way, described what he had reported, stuck to his facts, and he talked about it. And then another panelist said, let me tell you what I'd be concerned about. What we're really concerned about here is when they're looking at money laundering, you could be seeing, say, Russian money coming into the bank and coming in, and the money going out to the Trump business. You could see who's co-signing the loans and backing up. And when other banks wouldn't lend money to the Trump organization, why was Deutsche Bank doing that? Were Russian oligarchs co-signing the loans, and spun a few other possible scenarios. And fortunately, and I thought very, very importantly, the New York Times reporter sort of butted in at the end of this segment. Let me just say, I just wanted to point out that I've been working on this story for a long time, and I've never heard any mention of Russian money in anything, in any of my reporting. And I thought that I was glad to hear him say it. For all I know, there may be, but he was standing up for not just what he knew as a reporter, what he didn't know as a reporter. And that there's a difference between a reported story and a possible scenario that might square with the facts that have been turned up. And at the moment, there is, I think, in the name of naturalness and conversation, and let's have some interesting, smart people who come from different places and different points of view talk about this. I think that there is some lack of regard for the difference between good reporting and interesting commentary.
Do you think some of this happens with coverage of the rest of the world outside the United States? You were a foreign correspondent for a number of years.
Yeah.
And I look at, for instance, the coverage of the Brexit negotiations over the last several months. And, we know that the Prime Minister has been forced to resign because of it, but I confess it has not made me an expert in parliamentary procedure. I know a little bit about how Britain interfaces with the EU, but I can't escape the fact that it still feels similar in some ways, where the foreign correspondent is saying, yeah, people are divided over here just like you Yanks are.
Yes, I mean, there is actually an interesting thing when you're talking with Brits, that Brits and Americans both like to look at each other's politics and say, boy, I'm glad we're not the only crazy people in the world. There's this other country on the other side of the ocean that's just as nuts as we are. Let me talk about Europe. Because when I went over to London, it was '79, I had great hopes of trying to do some reporting on European integration. A subject which, while I was there, my wife actually took a master's degree at the LSE, at London School of Economics, in European integration. And I was convinced this was something very important and incredibly boring. It was really about European countries arguing over a budget and who should pay how much money. And I remember one story, the French were trying to export lamb into France, and the French farmers were throwing out their lamb at the ports, claiming that, remember a French farmer saying that the English cannot afford their own big lambs, they are too poor, and so they import lambs from New Zealand, little lambs which they can eat, and send their big lambs across the channel to France, and so this is unfair. And this would be the kind. I actually got that story on the air on NPR, but that was a typical European as it was then, communities or common market story. And I came away from my 4 years in London convinced that for a generation now, American journalists have been trying to communicate what the European Union, as it is now, is all about, and failing routinely. Why? One thing I now have come to believe is that because of the English language, we tend to see this process through British eyes. And the British view of European integration has, from the start, been kind of cranky and in some ways, very justifiably so. When I was there and my wife, taking her program, told me, there's going to be at some point a European passport. And I said, do you think any Brit would trade in British citizenship, would take some passport that applied equally to Portuguese and Italians and give up his British passport? Well, as it turned out, these things became pretty unpopular in time. But before Brexit, I was sent over for the Brexit vote, and before doing it, I wanted to try to explain what the European Union really means to Europeans, and went to the country that epitomizes how great it has worked, and that was Luxembourg. Tiny country. And
it helps when your country is the size of this room.
It does help, but when you're a little country like Luxembourg, you understand that if there's a continental war in Europe, which there used to be periodically, you lose. It's guaranteed you will be on the losing side. One way or the other, you will be occupied, defeated, however it might work out. And the European Union, which began as the European Coal and Steel Community and then the common markets, was this immensely creative idea to say, instead of having wars over coal and steel and industry and places with which you can make cannons and let's have a new common market in which we share control of these institutions, we make common policy, and we avoid the typical causes of continental wars. If you're my age, if you're about 70 years old, you have now lived through a time when there has not been a major European continental war. For the longest stretch that you can go back to, whatever was before the Napoleonic Wars and the 7 Years' War of 1756 to 1763, periodically Germany and France would have a war, and various countries in between would be trampled on. And Europe today, we do not think of Europe as a country about to erupt into continental conflict. And at least for Europeans on the continent, the EU is very much a part of that. The EU is very much a part of that. And it is a way it's a peace movement. It's a peace movement. It has, like American policies, it has serious failures. When I lived in London, one of the problems with the EU was that politicians who had been voted out of office in their own country somehow managed getting a job in Brussels and turning up to be European officials. And in fact, right now, the head of the Council of Europe is the very impressive former Prime Minister of Poland, Donald Tusk, who is very impressive, except that his party was voted out of office in Poland. I mean, he speaks for the Council of Europe, but not for the Poles. They have opted for a much more conservative, nationalistic party. So one thing was that people tended to regard it as an institution of the political elites. Also, it has been and remains a much more important institution for young people who are willing to get up and move to another country to go to university, for example. If they can go to university, they can study anywhere under the Erasmus program of the EU. Or the famous legendary Polish plumber can get a job fixing faucets in France or in England. This is, not such great news for the English plumber who feels that he's confronted with a lot of competition. But it has been the engine of a certain measure of European prosperity, but a major measure of European peace. And the current lack of concern for just the stability of Europe and the sense of common purpose, I just find appalling. I mean, I think that the promise of Brexit, that Britain could disentangle itself and experience a new prosperity was very misleading. And I thought that President Trump was very irresponsible in cheering on that, because there's a kind of Brit who actually believes that their special relationship with the United States, and throw in what they used to call the white Commonwealth, you know, Australia, New Zealand, Canada, that's a just as effective an alignment in the world as being related to Europe. And it just isn't true. I mean, the United States is not about to become the economic savior of British industry, and I think that our president lends some false credence to that idea.
Well, and it's hard to cover at a certain respect if you're a journalist, because you have to tell people a lot of background before they get to know what perhaps the average European might know. Let me get to another one of the questions that's come in from one of the listeners. It says, how do you think...
So you have very serious listeners.
We do have very serious listeners.
Right.
It says, how do you think journalists should respond to the current climate regarding the public's perception of journalists and the public's trust, and perhaps they should have said mistrust, in mainstream journalism?
Well, if you look at what the polls say the public thinks about the news media, we're really not the most believed people in the world. I mean, we've been pretty low for a long, long time. I think the answer is first of all, you check your own standards. I mean, when I was the news director of NPR, the hardest part when we got criticized, and I was the one who had to respond in some way, was to first say, let me think if they're right. Let me just go through this and make sure that I'm not going to defend us only on the basis of loyalty. Are we doing stuff right? Sometimes you might come across things that you're doing that lend real, lend some support to criticism, that you're not trusted for some reason. The way you describe things, the vocabulary you might use for them. If that's the case, you change. But basically, you adhere to good rules of good journalism. Hang in there. Broadcasting, and public broadcasting, I think especially, are very confusing, because we want people to listen to us, and part of that process is we want you to listen to the people, tune in regularly to hear these people on your favorite public radio show. So do we want you to like those people? Well, we want you to like listening to the program that those people are on. But ultimately, the bottom line of the news business is not how much people love you. It's not, they should feel that you're performing a useful service to them. But sometimes you're going to be criticized, and it's important that you stand up for what you've done, because the negative impression that's being reported is frankly it's ill-informed.
Is there too much assumption that liking a journalist or I'll even broaden it out, liking a member of the media, because they're not all journalists, and believing a member of the media are the same thing? Should there be more of a divorce between those things?
That's a very good question, and there probably should be a divorce. And I think that people on the inside of journalism should try to take on board how we're seen from the outside, and to understand that, to make sure that we're not simply operating on our own intentions, but on how our intentions are perceived. I mentioned that Peter Jennings was a friend. We became friends when I was working in London, and he was part of this thing ABC News did for a while, where they had 3 anchormen, one in New York, one in Chicago, and one in London. It was Peter. And I was home on home leave, and my parents were talking about, again, my parents were these linguistically obsessed, very literate, college-educated people. And I'd mentioned to them that Peter Jennings, I knew him as he was a friend in London. I thought he was very good. And they said, you know whom we really like? I think it was my father said, Alex Trebek. We really like Alex Trebek. And I tried to explain, Dad, Jennings is the anchorman of the evening news. Alex Trebek, it's a game show. He's very smart. He's a very smart guy. Very smart man, very articulate, very knowledgeable.
And they're both Canadians.
And they are both Canadian.
And Canadians are nice and likable, if you know nothing else.
They were. And my parents were, and I feel this coming on as I feel the media changing on my generation, but my parents were of a generation which they had very strong feelings about newspapers, about which ones were allowed in the house and which ones weren't. The Hearst newspapers were not allowed in the house. My mother regularly read the New York Post, which was the Bible of liberalism in New York City in those days. My father read the New York Times, but had a real soft spot for the Herald Tribune, which was regarded as the writer's paper. And he went back to before they were one paper and which one he preferred. He had loved a paper called PM, which was a nonprofit. It was a non-commercial newspaper that Marshall Field had owned at one point. And yes, it was derided by some. This is foreshadowing of his son's life. It was derided as the Uptown Daily Worker in some quarters, but it was a famous daily newspaper that had no advertising in it. And but in any case, when it came to newspapers or magazines, they had the most refined literary judgments. When it came to television, the news that would happen to be on at 10 o'clock, which was the trashiest local news program in New York, was on at the right hour, and so they watched that routinely. The difference between, they saw through a lot of things that should be seen through. They didn't see much difference between an entertainment program like Jeopardy and the 10 o'clock news show that they watched on New York Channel 5. Yeah.
We were talking about this in the newsroom the other day, that there was a poll a couple of years ago that showed that most people, or at least a large chunk of people who were, say, 12 to 30, got their news from Jon Stewart when he was the host of the Daily Show. Despite the fact that Jon Stewart and John Oliver and people like that take great pains to say, look, we are not journalists.
Yes.
You should not look at us that way. Yeah. But there's an obvious blurring that suggests.
Yes, I would have these rather difficult conversations with a young nephew that wasn't journalism. It was very smart, and it was quite well researched, but you really should go look, to the sources of this information. In truth, a few news organizations account for a lot of the real news-bearing work of American journalism, and they are then matched by everyone else. And it would be better, it would be healthier if there were more people. It's not as bad at the national level as it is at a local and state house level. We're seeing the new media erode newspapers, and a lot of local political decisions or state political decisions go essentially uncovered and unscrutinized for lack of journalists to be anywhere near it. So that's a serious problem. But yes, I mean, I've heard that, and when I heard my nephew talk about getting his news from Jon Stewart, I remembered my parents who really they liked Alex Trebek better than Peter Jennings.
I've met him. He's a likable guy. Yeah. And what you're getting at is something that I tell people around here too. I'm always grateful that people are listeners to the radio station, but I tell them too, I also would like you to read the local newspaper. I would like you to watch the news on one or more of the local nightly television station newscasts, because it's important to get that breadth, because there are things that the newspaper does that we don't do. There are things that we do that the TV stations don't do. And so let me engage you about coverage in this neck of the woods for a second. Here we are in Middle America, and one of the big criticisms of the national news organizations for many years has been, you're too coastal. There's way too much West Coast, way too much East Coast, especially inside the Beltway, despite the fact that you could logically argue, look what percentage of the population lives within 100 miles of an ocean. It's substantial.
Yes.
What do you think NPR should be doing, especially as we get into the 2020 election cycle in earnest? Spend more time in Middle America, spend more time where the population centers are and where a lot of the votes are going to be. What's the way we should trend there, do you think?
Well, let's start with the proviso. This is the first election in which I will not take part in any meetings about what NPR's strategy should be.
Right, so you can speak freely.
Well, and without any justification, without any research or look. First of all, there is something special and different about NPR. NPR is a rare media organization whose roots are not on the coasts. The roots of this are not in New York or Washington or Los Angeles or even Chicago. NPR came about really through the efforts of a few land-grant universities that, way back in the Kennedy administration, the head of the FCC, Newton Minow, declared American television as a vast wasteland. And so in the days when the government thought that if we had a problem, it should probably do something about it to solve it, someone said, let's create a corporation, let's create a public television system, a little like the BBC. We'll create a corporation for public television, and the public television bill will create funding it. It'll give money to public television stations. And a group of radio stations at land-grant universities typically got together and said, what about us? We also, American radio is also a wasteland. What about supporting non-commercial radio? I guess we didn't settle on the word public, I think, for a while. But in any case, they changed the corporate, Public Television Act to the Public Broadcasting Act, and the Corporation for Public Television to the Corporation for Public Broadcasting, and gave radio about 5% of the money that they would give out. And that's where our roots are. So we're a little bit, from the beginning, we were a little bit more based out of East Lansing and Austin and to some extent Lafayette. I don't think Lafayette was a founding member, but Columbus was. Columbus was a founding member of NPR. WBAA was. And we do have actually non-coastal roots. A lot of those people who live within the Beltway, I should add, by the way, spend a lot of time traveling outside the Beltway. Whether they're government officers or journalists or whoever they might be, I always get a kick out of it that we'd always be accused of spending a lot of time in this bubble inside Washington, and all of us are constantly traveling all over the country. And most of the people who would say that, who were in Columbus, Ohio, let's say, would typically not do a lot of travel out of Columbus, Ohio. They would just say that we were in the bubble because we lived in Washington. I think that one of the problems with following where you emphasize coverage is that there's a very small number of states where there's a contested presidential election. There is a fair number of states where there are contested congressional and Senate elections, so there's no reason to ignore all these states. But typically what happens is if you well, in recent years, it used to be that if you lived in my area, nobody paid any attention to Maryland because it was a lock every 4 years for the Democrats. Virginia used to be an interesting contest. It would be a state that could go either way, and it's now more predictably Democratic. And so North Carolina is becoming actually an interesting place where who knows which way it goes. So there is a natural attraction to places that are where there's a contest. The contest doesn't tell you that much more about how one party or the other might govern and what would be different if they're elected. And I think that has to remain the main offering of what we're doing. We have to be around the country, and we're well situated because of the station system and the integration of so many public radio reporters around the country into national coverage.
Well, and as those reporters go around the country, one of the things you would hope you would find is a citizenry that's ready to respond to what can be tough questions from reporters in some cases. And so I wanted to ask you about something that's actually been talked about here at Purdue. Mitch Daniels, the current president, the former governor, has proposed that there be a civics exam that graduates would have to pass before they're given a diploma with the Purdue letterhead on it. Do you think such a thing would be useful within our higher education system to create, would it achieve the goal that he has set out, which is create a more educated populace about the way of the workings of all levels of government and improve the ability of a voter to know what it is they're voting for and how to look for what they're voting for?
It sounds like a very good idea to me. It sounds a little late in the game. I would hope that you would leave high school having to pass such an exam, but yeah, I think that's a good idea. In order for me to graduate, I went to Columbia, and you had to swim 3 laps to graduate. And I remember there's a very famous psychiatrist, Alvin Toussaint, who described having to swim the 3 laps in the last week of college, because if he didn't make it, he couldn't get his diploma. I think a civics course would be more useful than swimming 3 laps. There is something wrong with how people are taught about media and about politics. I remember, in the New York City public schools, we were actually taught the good neighbor fold. Since we were discouraged in class to read a tabloid, you would be reading the New York Times or the Herald Tribune or whatever, and you learned how you would sit in the bus to hold this broadsheet paper and go from one page to the next. And I thought back on this a few years ago and thought that...
Without disturbing the person next to you.
Without disturbing the person next, hence the good neighbor fold. And you would sort of do a half a page vertically at a time. I think today if a school ruled out certain newspapers that you could use, that would be a hugely controversial decision today. I mean, it would be considered some kind of bias. I think that when I was growing up, there was a lot more confidence in judgments as to what was appropriate, what was done seriously, what you should read, and what was junk. So yeah, I think that if people had to pass a civic, as I say, if you can't do it by high school graduation, it would be a bad sign if only college graduates knew how the country worked, because that's only about a third of us, I suppose. And that actually is a real challenge for the media, which is, NPR, I think, did address a very important gap when it was created, in that people who were actually curious about the world and could read at a more than a 9th grade level, I think felt very ill-served by the general commercial media offering and broadcasting. And public broadcasting did a lot to address their concerns. The other concern is all the people who do read it at 9th grade level, which is lots of people, and who's catering to them? Where's the journalism for people who are not highly educated and who don't spend their life's work in front of a computer screen and feel comfortable with that world? That used to be local television, network television, I think. The newspapers that served that group have mostly folded, picture newspapers. You can't have I don't think you can have a democratic society in which you need a bachelor's degree to take part in the debate. One year, I think it was 92, there was a Democratic primary debate, and there were 6 Democrats sitting around a table talking about what kind of public health insurance plan we should have. Should it be a pay to play? Should it be a single payer? Should it be this? Should it be that? Should it be that? And I remember listening to this and thinking, how would my grandfather, who got nationalized in 1940, I guess, what would he have made of this? He could vote. He could. I never fully understood him when he spoke English, but he could speak some English. How would he vote on which form of health insurance we should go to? How is that a question for an ordinary American voter? How are we communicating with people who do not want to read a 400-page book describing the result of an investigation, let's say?
So let me let you leave on this.
Are we ready to leave already?
In terms of that idea of expectation, for the folks in the audience, and thank you all again for being here tonight, what should these folks be able to expect of journalism in the next 5 years, 10 years? What should their kids be able to expect of the profession going forward, given what a lot of people see as challenges to it at the moment?
Well, we may finally be getting what the optimists forecast when the web first came about, which was, I remember people saying, you know, in this new world in which there are going to be a zillion different people all talking and writing about everything, there'll be much more importance for the trusted brands because people will recognize who that is. The exact opposite has happened in the years since, and there's been a great mixing up of respected news organizations and guys with the general demeanor of the drunk at the end of the bar, mouthing off about the world. But I think that we're now mature enough about this. I think it may be that the technology is now commonplace enough that people can get smarter about what they're looking at. And you will see, I think, a very talented generation of reporters who are coming up and who are able to bypass these very slow career ladders that they might have faced in the past, because some of them are doing work which gets straight to readers or listeners or viewers online. And I think that we may see a great reordering of young people with better talents creating a new kind of journalism. So when I got bitten with the idea of working in radio, I didn't know that NPR was even conceived of at that point. And I ended up working in a place for my whole career, practically, after the first few years, that had not existed when I began and decided to do this. And I think that that's a healthy expectation when we think about media and how much it all changes, that 5 years from now, we may have a vague memory of what tweets were, but we may all be very much impressed with some new system in which people are communicating their writing and their thoughts. So I would be optimistic. May I say one last thing? I just want to tell people about how nice it is to actually see people who listen to NPR. That when you do the programs, and when I did it for all those years, you look at the engineer through the glass, you look at the director, and they tell you there are a couple of million people tuning in at this moment, but you don't see them. And it's a paralyzing thought to think that you're talking to that many people. And there was a great NBC journalist who once, one of the great lessons I ever heard, Frank McGee, said that since it was absolutely impossible to talk to, in his case, 20 million people or something at once, he always spoke to his father in his mind. He had an image of whom he was talking to, and that's how he did it. But we know that you're out there, we just don't see you. So it's nice to actually meet people who listen. And when we do meet you, when I do, I'm always struck by the fact that you don't look anything like what I thought you would look like. I thought you'd all be much taller and have more hair, and it's been very nice to see the faces of you. Actually, you look like people who support a public radio station, and there's nothing more heartening for people who work in public radio and who are part of this remarkable system, and people like even me who've been recently promoted to the august rank of listener. So.
Well, you spoke this morning when we were chatting about being someone who liked the idea of keeping a little more formality.
Yes.
And so let me say, Mr. Siegel, it's been enormously enjoyable, and thank you so much for being here. Ladies and gentlemen, Robert Siegel.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
It's my pleasure. Thank you. Thank you.